Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 375. This week the questions are taken from guide 443 on the Zuihō, a Japanese light carrier, as well as the Wednesday video on the US Navy's railway batteries of World War I, and the Friday video on the Danube flotilla of Hungary. PH89787 asks, could carrier divisions 1 and 2 at Midway have survived if Zuihō was transferred to the Kido Butai prior to Midway, instead of covering the invasion force? I think maybe, but it depends on how much of a diversion from the historical setup you actually want to go with. Zuihō is actually fast enough to keep up with the Kido Butai. She's not fast enough by a long shot to keep up with Hiryu, Soryu, and Akagi, but she is just about fast enough to keep up with Kaga, and everyone else has to slow down to allow Kaga to keep up. So there's that. Now, if you were to just move Zuihō from the invasion force to the Kido Butai, I don't think she's going to save carrier divisions 1 and 2, because her historical loadout, in terms of what's actually going to matter in this case, which is fighters, is just a dozen fighters. She's got a bunch of strike aircraft as well, but they aren't going to do anything to save carrier divisions 1 and 2. So she's got half a dozen A5Ms, half a dozen A6Ms, so obviously the latter being the 0. That's a fairly small fighter force, and the A5M in particular would potentially have issues intercepting American aircraft. So with a relatively small potential combat air patrol up, and every chance that it might therefore also just go after targets the same way that all the other combat air patrol zeros historically did, then while it is theoretically possible that a relatively small, like 2, 3, 4 aircraft combat air patrol from Zuihō might be in a position where they could try and intercept one or the other of the Dauntless strikes. A, that's very unlikely. B, while they could disrupt somewhat, 3 or 4 fighters isn't going to be enough to really, especially for the big attack that hits Akagi and Kaga, it's not really going to throw off all of those aircraft if they physically can't. There's a very, very small outside chance that maybe they just disrupt the one attack that's necessary to save Akagi, but that's extremely unlikely. And of course, that's to say nothing about the attack on Soryu. Now, at that point, really the only way she's meaningfully going to contribute to the survival of carrier divisions 1 and 2 is if some of the Dauntlesses decide to go after her for whatever reason and therefore don't go after Akagi, Kaga, or Soryu, or later on Hiryu. And by just absorbing bombs, she might therefore do some good. Because again, it's going to be which aircraft actually attack her. Because if it's the aircraft that puts the bomb on Akagi, then sure, that saves Akagi. If she gets attacked by half a dozen of the aircraft that historically missed anyway, then all that's accomplished is another carrier gets at least damaged, if not sunk as well. If you were to divert from the historical timeline a little bit more and maybe say that, okay, they decide to assign Zuihō to the Kido Butai from the start of the whole operation, rather than just transferring her midway through the voyage, presumably as some kind of like half-baked replacement for Zuikaku and Shokaku, and you were to load her entirely with fighters and assign her to basically just be a big combat air patrol carrier, that could potentially be helpful. Now, of course, again, it depends, where are her combat air patrol fighters? Do they end up out of position the same way that everybody else's do? But if she's carrying 24 plus zeros, and she's got maybe a dozen of them up in the air, and they're not out of position when the Dauntlesses attack, then a dozen plus zeros, maybe with some more on their way up, that might be enough to disrupt the attack that does in for Akagi and Kaga, at which point that then might save at least some of the carriers. And again, also she might also be a bit of a bomb magnet if they mistake her for something else. So that might save at least some of the Japanese forces at Midway from that initial attack, but that requires an ahistorical loadout of aircraft, and B, still a reasonable amount of good fortune in terms of the positioning of her combat air patrol. Redosaurus asks, Considering how many heavy cruisers had relatively poor armour, wouldn't it have made far more sense to build a bunch of light cruisers made to simply overwhelm and destroy whatever ocean commerce the intended enemy actually had, basically reenacting SMS Emden's voyage, except in multiple? It depends largely on time period and what else you intend to use your cruisers for, because yes, if you are intending purely to use your cruisers as a commerce raiding force, then more 6-inch guns are perfectly capable of dealing with any arbitrary number of merchant ships. The larger problem is going to come when you try and use them for anything else. So when you start using your cruisers as a fleet screen, then he who has the 8-inch guns, well, they can range out further than 6-inch guns can, and they maintain their accuracy for longer, which means he who has the 8-inch cruiser should be able to, beat off and disperse and possibly even destroy 6-inch cruisers coming at the fleet screen, and of course that means recon advantage to he who has the 8-inch cruiser. Plus, the 8-inch guns, while they can't penetrate capital ship citadels and so forth, the 8-inch shell has some effect, some use as a secondary ship, a secondary backup, if you like, in a battle line engagement. I.e., they can put some hurt on the non-citadel, non-turret portions of enemy capital ships. And of course, you have the US Navy figuring that actually at under 10,000 yards, an 8-inch cruiser might have an advantage over a lightly protected vessel like a Congo. 6-inch ships, that really doesn't apply anywhere near as much. Again, range issues as well as actual lethality, not just of the shells, but also the armor-piercing capability. And of course, if you're doing commerce raiding and the enemy who's defending their commerce shows up with some 8-inch cruisers on escort, again, you would face issues. Now, of course, you might argue rate of fire could help overcome some of those issues as long as the ship is fast enough to close the range. And that is certainly an argument, and it's certainly the one that was put forward with the development of the 10,000-ton 6-inch cruisers in the 30s. However, this is where time period comes into play. Because, yes, by the early 1930s, you could put a dozen or 15 6-inch guns with a pretty high rate of fire on a 10,000-ton hull, and then, in theory, get close enough that you could absolutely plaster an enemy who had 8 or 9 or 8-inch guns and take advantage of the relatively weak armor. However, that's the 1930s. When you're looking at the 1920s, particularly the beginning of the 1920s, when all these various programs for things like the counties and the Pensacola's are getting underway, at that point, the 6-inch guns that they have available to them are basically the latest 6-inch guns from the World War I time period, and their rate of fire, whilst faster than the rate of fire of the 8-inch gun, is not substantially faster. You're talking, depending on the 8-inch gun and the 6-inch gun in question, somewhere between 30 to 50%, maybe a fraction more in some of the better cases, faster rate of fire, which, given the much greater arm-piercing capability and hitting power of the 8-inch, it just doesn't add up. Whereas when you get to the 30s and your 6-inch guns can, at least on paper, output at about twice the rate or more of the 8-inch guns, now you're flinging enough steel down range for it to actually make a difference. Almirante Brown asks, how would Japan's warship construction program in World War II have benefited if the resources dedicated to the Yamato-class battleship program were instead invested in new slipways, drydocks, and related infrastructure before the war? Would that infrastructure investment have allowed Japan to commission meaningful numbers of additional aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers during the conflict? Well, it depends exactly on what they're investing all their money and resources into, but if we wanted to go for a, shall we say, somewhat optimistic, although not massively, ridiculously over-optimistic interpretation of things. So instead of massively expanding the two facilities that they end up using to build Yamato and Musashi, they instead do whatever work is necessary at those locations to allow them to construct a Shikaku or Taiho-sized vessel, if they have to do anything at all. And the rest of those resources go into constructing a new slipway at each location, or Yamato in Kure, Musashi in Nagasaki. And let's say, for sake of being at least vaguely conservative, that maybe there's enough resources in there to build one additional slipway-drydock setup. Now, if you then don't build Yamato and Musashi, then that means at the beginning of 1938, roughly speaking, you could lay down another couple of Shikaku-class carriers, or some other equivalent thereof, whether that be Taiho or whatever. The next thing to take into account is that when you look at the time spent on the slipways, Yamato and Musashi take somewhat longer, about half again as long, maybe a little bit more or less, depending on exactly how you measure it, to go from keel laying to launch as a Shikaku class does. So let's use the Shikaku as our bench line. So instead of building Yamato and Musashi, you're able to build 3 Shikaku class, assuming that you're able to get another slipway drydock setup out of the investment. And they're all going to hit the water in mid to late 39, which means that you could then, assuming you have the money, start to build more carriers. So, for example, over in Yokosuka, after you've launched Shikaku, there's historically a bit of a gap, then they start building Shinano. So, in theory, if you don't do that and you just go straight into building another Shikaku or Shikaku derivative, in theory, you could have another, this would be a 4th additional Shikaku hull in the water by early 41. Obviously, you then have to fit out and commission the thing. And then you would have in mid 39 another carrier hull going down in the yard where Yamato is historically built. And obviously, because you're not building hull 111, the next Yamato class, you'd be looking at probably mid 41 for that one to come off the slipway, and late 41 for the one in the Nagasaki number 1 dock where Musashi was historically built to come off the slipway, and again probably early to mid 41 for the hypothetical additional slipway that you've managed to construct. Now, Zuihō's yard, before you ask, they put Hio in for conversion immediately after, so rule that one out. But essentially that means that by late 41, by the time of the Pearl Harbor attacks going in, you would have in various states of completion, either almost ready to commission in some cases, or in other cases still fitting out, 5 additional fleet carrier hulls. Now, I would say that, you know, the not Yamato, not Musashi, and the 3rd new slipway, so 3 of those, would be ready easily in time to join in the Pearl Harbor attack. And then the subsequent other hulls would be coming on in 42, coming online during 42. That would actually be a fairly substantial advantage for the Japanese, with the sole caveat, of course, to all of this, that financially speaking, I think, you probably could justify saying there'd be another couple of Shikakus instead of Yamato and Musashi, probably the 3rd on the newly built slipway. The larger question would be the later hulls, so the ones that would be coming in after Shikaku on her slipway and after Yamato Musashi and this other 3rd slipway. Those 4 hulls, would they actually be done? Would the Japanese have the money and the resources to do it? That's a lot more of an open question, but to be honest, even 3 additional Shikaku hulls is still a fairly big, meaningful advantage. I mean, it's not going to change the overall outcome of the war, but it certainly is going to make it a lot more painful in the first half of the Pacific campaign. Jeff asks, if on May 23rd, 1941, Hood signals to advise that she has wrecked her 2 starboard turbines and therefore cannot continue the chase for the Bismarck, how would Tovey have deployed the fleet to continue the chase? Now, this does lead to a rather interesting set of circumstances, because on the 23rd, King George V and Victorious have already been at sea for about 24 hours or so. They sailed a bit later than Hood and Prince of Wales, but they did sail. Now, that in turn leaves you with one of 2 options. I mean, you're definitely going to send Prince of Wales to join up with Norfolk and Suffolk, who are doing the shadowing effort. But you have option 1, a modified version of Admiral Holland's plans, which would be to attack at night, because theoretically you still do have a slight margin of superiority. You've got 1 battleship apiece, but you have 2 heavy cruisers to the enemy 1. And in this circumstance, since you're now not having to race to catch up and intercept Bismarck the way that Hood and Prince of Wales did historically, you can also bring along your half-dozen destroyers, which now means you have a it's a reasonable preponderance of force, especially for a night attack. So on the one hand, Tovey could order Prince of Wales, the 6 destroyers, and Norfolk and Suffolk to basically trail the Germans, with the Prince of Wales and its destroyers perhaps hanging slightly further back so that Bismarck doesn't have necessarily an idea that they're there. And then, come close of the light, then Prince of Wales and her escorts close it up and join up with Norfolk and Suffolk, and then as the light fails, they all move in as a big group and try and swarm the Germans from behind. However, that is still predicated on the fact that you're going 1v1 for battleships, which could obviously, theoretically, end badly if Prince of Wales takes hits. So while you would, in theory, have a decent chance with, as I say, 6 destroyers, 2 heavy cruisers and a battleship versus a heavy cruiser and a battleship, the other option, since Tovey is only a day and a half sailing behind, would be a similar start. So you have Prince of Wales and the destroyers sit behind Norfolk and Suffolk, but then have King George V and Victorious put pedal to the metal to try and catch up with them. Victorious then launches its initial airstrikes as soon as humanly possible, as soon as they're within range, to start dropping torpedoes in on Bismarck and or Prince Eugen, with the objective being that Victorious keeps up a series of airstrikes to try and reduce and or slow down the enemy forces, and hope the fuel on your destroyers holds out long enough for King George V to catch up, at which point then you go for either a day or a night attack pretty much at your will, because then at that point you're talking about 2 heavy cruisers, 2 modern fast battleships, plus destroyers, because you'd have 1 or 2 more coming up with Tovey, and ongoing air support, and then you just move in and hit Bismarck like that. That would be the safer bet, and to be honest, I think that's probably the way that Tovey would play it, unless the destroyers signal that they maybe only have 48 hours worth of fuel left, and it's a kind of, we go in and attack now, or we just don't. And in those circumstances, perhaps you might have a layered approach where you go in with the destroyers running in for a close-in torpedo attack, with standoff support from Norfolk, Suffolk, and Prince of Wales, because then if the torpedo attack doesn't go particularly well, either with ships getting hit, i.e. British ships getting hit, or the torpedoes just missing, then the 3 bigger ships can fall back, and the destroyers can fall back. But if the torpedo strikes do land and cripple Bismarck and or Prince Eugen, then the Norfolk, Suffolk, and Prince of Wales are in the immediate vicinity to take advantage of that. But outside of destroyer fuel issues, I think Tovey would play it safe and get King George V and Victorious to come up and join in as well. M. Denman asks, having just been on board HMS Belfast, I was left wondering how on earth did they launch torpedoes? In the area where they say the torpedo launchers were, it was so small. Did they just kick them over the side? So here's Belfast in her near enough original configuration, and if you look carefully, between and below the first 2 sets of twin 4-inch guns, you can just about see the torpedo launcher, or at least the port side torpedo launcher. Now, what you might immediately notice is that basically that whole area above the upper strake of armour is very open. And obviously that's where the torpedo launcher is, nice and the midships, and then you've got this upper level, which is where all of the anti-aircraft guns are. However, apart from the forward superstructure, this area here is probably the most heavily rebuilt area on Belfast. And so what you see today is completely different. So bear in mind, she goes through a number of refits. She loses her torpedoes immediately after the Second World War, but the launch is still there. So if you look at photographs of her in Korea, she still has the launchers there. She just doesn't have any torpedoes on board. And then in the 55 refit, when she gets into the condition that you see her in now, then that's when the torpedo launchers go, and this whole area gets, as I say, very heavily reconstructed. So if we switch over to a post-refit photo, and then we look at the roughly the same area in question, you'll see very quickly that not only has a portion of the hull now been built up and that open area covered over, you can also see the aftmost of the twin 4-inch has been replaced by this structure that's been built up and around it. So, and that level where the twin 4s are, etc., that's where you will generally be walking when you're aboard Belfast. And the area where the triple tubes would have been is basically now that last open spot, the open spot that's just above the Hull Armour Strait closest to us. But as you can see, not only is there more structure that's been built after that on that level, it's less open than it was, but also forward, obviously it's all been enclosed, and I suspect they probably also brought some of the internal bulkheads a little bit further out as well. And that specific area, if I recall correctly, nowadays basically isn't accessible on the regular tour route for visitors, because you'd walk along her port side, which is what you can see here, which I actually see in both photos. And then the gangway is obviously coming down onto the quarterdeck, but the stairs that you take down to the quarterdeck level to then head to the stern and obviously off the ship, they're actually positioned somewhat further back. So the area is accessible, but I think, if I remember from my various trips aboard Belfast, to actually get to where the torpedo launchers themselves physically used to be, you'd have to go into the sort of private restricted area of the ship, so you can only do that at certain times and if you're there for certain reasons. Strider Pup asks, why were the US Navy's 14-inch railguns that accurate? Was it because of the training of the naval crews, or for some other reason? Partly the training and partly just the nature of the scenario and the nature of the guns, because you've got to remember that these guns are designed to hit a battleship-sized target reasonably often at ranges in the low double digits of miles, ideally, from a moving ship, so a ship that's not just moving forward, but it's moving in all three dimensions because it's pitching and rolling and rising and falling with the sea and all of this. And their target is also moving and pitching and rolling and rising with the sea and potentially even taking a degree of evasive action, although that's not really built into the gun's accuracy, that last bit. But anyway, the point is these guns are designed to be extremely accurate weapons, and of course, firing really big heavy shells. Those shells have an awful lot of inertia. They're less susceptible to atmospheric effects than, say, a 4, 5, or 6-inch shell. Now, couple that with the fact that the targets that you're firing at aren't firing back at you. You've got actually considerably more space to play with. Yes, the internal part of the car is relatively limited, but overall the amount of space you've got to play with compared to being in a gun turret is a bit more generous. And then unlike on a battleship where you arrive at your fire control solution and then you have to basically time it with how the ship is moving, in this scenario you are basically stationary. Your target is stationary, so you can delete huge amounts of complicated mathematics from your calculations of for your fire control solution. And all of that means that compared to firing at a target at sea, this is essentially child's play, especially when you've got very detailed maps and aerial spotting, so you can work out distances almost down to the foot. And then on top of that, of course, you have the fact that if you fire your first round and it's slightly off target, well, if you're engaging at sea, you've got to try and make the necessary corrections, but also the situation that you're in has changed because, of course, distance between targets may have changed, speed of target, bearing of target, what you and the target are doing, all of that will have changed. So you're making an adjustment, but you're also making a recalculation if you're doing this at sea. Whereas if you're doing it on land, the tunnel or the railhead or whatever, that hasn't gone anywhere. So you don't need to recalculate the position of the target. And once you've rolled the gun forward after recoil, you don't even need to necessarily worry all that much about your position because you're going to be pretty much exactly where you were as well. So that means that any slight deviation that the first shell has experienced, you know precisely what the corrections are that you need to make for the next shot. And then assuming all is well, then you'll get hit. And of course, you get multiple chances to do it again and again and again, as opposed to at sea, where basically every shot is to a certain degree a brand new calculation. So it's basically naval gunnery, but on easy mode. and therefore, put trained naval gunners in what's essentially for them even better than a normal training situation, they're going to be surprisingly accurate. Alkanautitz asks, could I ask about the major shipyards on the main island of Britain, like a top 10 kind of thing? Unfortunately, what you'd have to do would be to specify a time period, because Britain has such a long major shipbuilding history that the top 10 dockyards and shipyards in 1939 are going to be very different to that in 1914, which are going to be very different to that in 1860, which are going to be very different to that in 1815, or 1700, or 1680, etc., etc. And allow me to explain. So there are several major factors that see some British shipyards rise to stupendous heights, while others decline to either a secondary role or actually just they stop being shipyards at all. And a lot of that is to do with the size of the ships in question, as well as the level of industrialization required. So this, for example, is the launch of HMS Trafalgar in the early 1840s at Woolwich Dockyard. Now, as you might gather from the size of the Trafalgar, the size of the crew, etc., the spectators as well, the Woolwich Dockyard was a hugely important dockyard for the Royal Navy during the Age of Sail. Same thing for the Deptford Dockyard and Chatham. All these things, the first two are on the Thames, Chatham is on the Midway. Massively, massively important shipyards during pretty much the entirety of the Age of Sail for the Royal Navy. However, as ships get larger and larger, the area that they have to launch in, the rivers themselves, starts to look a little bit suspect, because you may not be able to physically get the ship across the width of the river, and even if you can, it may well end up running around on the other bank. And also because obviously Chatham is in Chatham, but Woolwich and Deptford are gradually subsumed into Greater London, there's not really much space to expand those yards either, to make the slipways bigger, and bringing in heavy bits of iron and later steel. Also very difficult when you're surrounded by urban conurbation. And so while in, let's say, 1790, at the height of the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, Woolwich and Deptford are kicking out ships left, right and centre, hugely important. By 1900, they're gone. Woolwich Arsenal is still around, but as a shipbuilding concern, the Deptford and Woolwich docks are long since dead by the time of Dreadnought, for instance. Chatham does hold out a little bit longer, but even for Chatham, as you go through the late 19th century, the size of ship relative to the biggest ships the Royal Navy builds is gradually diminishing until eventually it gets to a point where Chatham basically can no longer build anything really worthwhile for the Royal Navy. Although it's still used as a refit facility and a base for a very long time after that, it's not building major warships for the Royal Navy anymore. Similar things happen to places like Pembroke Dock. Really, really important in the Age of Sail, the Ironclad period, even launches a few pre-dreadnoughts, but size-wise just can't keep up with the rise of the dreadnoughts period, and so gradually diminishes. Then another version of this is places, especially on the south coast. So you might have heard, if you're interested in your medieval history, of the sank ports, as in the fret, not sunk as in S-U-N-K or S-A-N-K, sank. Sank as in un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq, 5 in French. And although there were originally 5, that term actually grew to include a number of other ports, so more than 5 by the height of the medieval period. But a good number of those original and later affiliated sank port sites, while hugely important for shipbuilding in the early to mid-medieval period, even by what you might term the start of the classic Age of Sail, the Elizabethan period going into the Stuart period, are mostly irrelevant because silting has either meant that the towns themselves are actually not even on the coast anymore. So, for example, Romney and Sandwich are literally over a mile from the sea. They're not ports, they're just towns that happen to be near the coast now. Others like Hythe, and for those of you who are of a railway bent, obviously that's the New Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch railway area. Hythe is still technically a port, but it doesn't, as in it's still on the coast, but the harbour that it used to have has been massively silted up, and it's not good for anything other than the occasional pleasure craft now. Pretty much the only one of the sank ports that remains a major player in, naval terms is Dover. So those are obviously all yards that have been on the decline, but then as the Industrial Revolution kicks off and population increases and relocations take place, other ports come to prominence. So, for example, Liverpool and Birkenhead, just across the river, up until the early 1700s, functionally irrelevant as far as the Royal Navy is concerned. Then trade starts to pick up, along with the silting up of other rivers and ports nearby, and suddenly, over the 1700s, it develops to be reasonably important, although mostly mercantile. And then as you get into the 1800s, the explosion of trade, industry, and population now means that full-on shipyards start to be established, and that's where you get things like Camel Laird's. And so over that period, and then as you lead into the full-on Industrial Revolution, loads of shipyards start to spring up in areas that 50, 100 years ago probably hadn't even registered on anybody's radar as being towns or ports of any value whatsoever in the grand scheme of things, let alone as major shipyards for naval bases and so forth. And then, of course, you have the interwar period massive diminishment of the shipyards as well, hence why I drew a distinction between World War I and World War II. So, yeah, if you want a top 10 of major shipyards in the UK, you have to be very specific in terms of time period. Otherwise, I can tell you what maybe the two most important shipyards in the 13th century were, but the answer to the same question in the 15th, 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, they're all going to be very different. H.G. Schurtugel, I think, asks, would it be a good idea if Germany had used railway guns on the Atlantic Wall instead of fixed emplacement guns? They could then move them to active areas and thus be a more credible threat to the Allied navies. Theoretically, railway guns would allow you to concentrate a much larger artillery battery against a potential Allied landing. And indeed, the Germans did have some rail-mounted heavy artillery, particularly used in the Dover guns duel in the early to middle part of World War II. This is one of those German railway guns in the picture. However, there's two very big problems with the idea. Well, the largest one is that if you're talking about an Atlantic Wall situation, so the Allies are coming over to invade, they're going to be doing an awful lot of recon. They're going to spot all the railways, and they're going to, at some point or other, have gotten awareness of the railway guns as well. And so you can absolutely guarantee that the railway tracks, points, switches, railheads, potentially even the sheds for the railway guns, if they're not really well hidden and secured, are going to be targets for sabotage and bombing in the run-up to the invasion. And therefore, while in theory you could move the rail guns or railway guns into place to prepare for an invasion, the most likely scenario is simply that the Allies will cut those railway connections, and so you will have your railway guns, but they will be dozens and dozens of miles away from where you actually need them to be, because the railways don't work anymore. The secondary issue is, of course, the fact that because the railway guns have to be at least somewhat lighter weight, so allow them to be moved on the rails, like you can see here, there's not even a gun shield, let alone an armoured turret involved. And that means that even if there's an unbroken railway line, or you manage to repair a railway line or whatever, there is going to be a huge amount of vulnerability for those railway guns as and when Allied air power swoops in, both in terms of damaging the guns themselves, the crew, the trains, etc., etc. Now, you could mitigate that somewhat by having perhaps pre-prepared bunker-like facilities which you can then drive a railway gun into, perhaps with a big turntable inside, and then from within there you can use it like it's a bunker gun. But at that point, it will probably be easier just to build a big gun in a bunker. And yes, you don't have the mobility, but if you want the concentration of force, it means you're going to have to build dozens of these fairly complex enclosed armoured turntable bunker emplacements with a very extensive railway line, all of which is predicated on the idea that you will actually be able to move all of these guns into place before either the guns or the railways get blown up by Allied air power. So it's a case of, in an ideal circumstance, great. Practically, not so great. And B2 Tall asks, would it have been beneficial to build these railway guns, that's the American 14 inches, around a smaller gun, but still perhaps with a long-range barrel, say a 12-inch, and then reap the benefits of a more mobile, rail-friendly and higher rate of fire unit as opposed to 14-inch or greater guns and the issues covered in the videos? And could these smaller, lighter but still formidable guns have accomplished a great majority of the fire missions that the 14-inch guns would have been assigned? Unfortunately, not really, because you've got to remember, as I kind of covered in the initial part of that video, there already were a substantial number of 12-inch rail guns or railway guns around on the Western Front on both sides. Mostly old pre-dreadnought guns and stuff, but some spares from later gun stocks as well. The fundamental issue was that, well, apart from the fact that obviously a 14-inch gun, thanks to the square cube law, is going to fire an awful lot more explosive downrange than a 12-inch gun will, and therefore will have a greater effect at the other end when that explosive lands, the other issue is not just range to hit target, but range to hit target from a safe position. Because when you've got various heavy howitzers and 12-inch and associated guns, caliber guns, already on the front lines, then if you have your own 12-inch gun, even if it's a 12-inch 45 or a 12-inch 50, you are aiming for targets substantially behind the enemy lines. If the enemy has a roughly similar gun to you with a roughly similar range, you fire at the target, they can counter battery you. And that's not going to end well, usually. Whereas if you have a really big gun, like say a 14-inch gun, and therefore can not only outrange the enemy guns that can get close enough to the front line to try for counter battery, but outrange them by so much that you can be pretty much almost entirely out of the range of enemy counter battery fire and still able to fire over the heads of said guns to hit targets well behind the front lines, that's where the real utility is, and that's where you need something like the 14-inch guns. If they'd wanted smaller, lighter weight railway guns to engage in counter battery duels with their German counterparts, then sure, they could have done 12-inch railway guns. But if they want to, within a reasonably defined version of peace, merrily blast away at targets well behind the German front lines, they need the extra range that you can get out of the 14-incher. Galeas of Martinengo asks, as losses to US Navy subs mounted in 1943 and 44, is there any record of the Japanese Navy trying to come up with an emergency escort program? And would you attribute the Japanese Navy's lack of preparedness in convoy escort partly to inter-service rivalry, since most of the transports were army ships? There's a small degree of inter-service rivalry going on, but to be perfectly honest, the vast majority of the Japanese Navy's relative lack of preparedness for anti-submarine warfare comes down to part of their strategy that, to a limited degree, makes sense. But it's it half makes sense and half doesn't. So essentially the thinking went that if we get to a point where we're in a circumstance where we have to actually fight convoy wars, i.e. a long drawn-out naval campaign, then something has already gone horribly, horribly wrong, because, of course, they were aiming for a quick, sharp war with a decisive battle, and then, theoretically, the enemy would cave. Now, in and of itself, that's not a terrible estimation of things, because, well, yeah, ultimately, when they did end up in a convoy war with huge amounts of losses to submarines, they were in an exceptionally bad situation that they really shouldn't have been in. However, Their solution to that was essentially to go all glory to the frontline combat units. They are the things that will decide the war. And if you end up being assigned to convoy escort ships and convoy escort duty, then clearly you didn't make the cut for frontline combat, and therefore clearly you are dishonorable, and nobody wants to be dishonorable, therefore nobody really wanted to do the convoy escort work. And that leads to kind of a circular feedback loop. However, with all that said, once they looked out at the world situation as World War II heated up, they realized, well, we are an island nation that ideally needs a quick win. The UK is also an island nation that needs a quick win, but they're having to fight the mother of all convoy wars. Maybe we should start building some convoy escorts? And so they start with a convoy escort program, which in terms of capabilities would be broadly analogous to the Corvette program in the UK. And that's what you've been seeing on screen so far, one of several classes of what they termed a Kaibokan, which to say that they're broadly analogous to a Japanese effort to do something similar to a flower class. They're sub 20 knots, and they're relatively small, 800-900 tons-ish. The main difference being that the Japanese version, as you can probably see, is much more heavily armed with guns and actually somewhat less heavily armed in terms of depth charges. And they actually started building these in 1939, not this particular one, but a variant thereof in 1939, and they would keep building them throughout the war in a series of small class runs. And you might think that's not necessarily a brilliant idea, and I tend to agree, because essentially what they were doing was going, okay, our first version was a bit like the sloop in the Royal Navy pre-World War II. It's a way of getting around the treaty restrictions, because they were ordering and building these and designing them even before the treaty came in, but also, as a result, they weren't the best suited for mass production. But once they had a simplified model that was more suited for mass production, they kept iterating down into simpler and simpler and simpler versions, which in theory made each individual ship quicker and easier to produce, but I think switching over from one to the other to the other to the other probably didn't help things. And these ships actually suffered from one relatively major problem, apart from the slightly behind the times status of Japanese depth charges and sonar compared to obviously somewhere like the UK. And that was that while they are roughly speed-wise equivalent to, or maybe even fractionally faster than a flower class, the opposition they faced, the US fleet boats, were unusually quick on the surface. So a US fleet boat, if it was caught on the surface by one of these Kaibokan, could simply put pedal to the metal, and if it had a 5-inch deck gun, might actually even outgun it in a chase, because obviously at that point the Japanese ship's only going to bring its forward gun to bear, and it could just outrun the thing, which occasionally was a problem with German U-boats. However, German U-boats either didn't have a speed advantage over a flower class, or if they did, it was a very marginal one, whereas the US fleet boats would typically have a 3-knot-ish speed advantage over the Kaibokan. So that was a little bit of a weakness for them. But hey, they were relatively cheap and simple to mass produce, but still, the Japanese also developed the Type D destroyer, the Matsu class, and then followed on with that with the Tachibana class, which you can see a Matsu class here. And these were somewhat larger, simplified destroyers, so you would call them either destroyer escorts or frigate equivalents. And one of the key things they had, apart from being slightly larger, was obviously they were slightly faster, and therefore they, like the frigates in the Atlantic, could outrun and run down submarines. So these were somewhat more effective, and these were introduced in the latter stages of the war. They were incredibly heavily simplified, and indeed the main difference between the Matsus and the Tachibanas is, after having started production on the Matsus, the Japanese designers sat down and went, what else can we eliminate or simplify? So the Tachibanas are kind of a cut-down version of a cut-down version already. But obviously at that point it was a bit too little too late, because by the time they recognized that actually the US submarines are beginning to cause a major problem, you have to go through the design stage, the build stage, and then introducing them into service. And during all that time period, obviously US subs are doing quite a number on the Japanese merchant shipping fleet. Nathan Redder asks, when did Zulu time enter regular worldwide service? How did other nations coordinate operations in different time zones without it? And did the lack of use of Zulu time botch any plans? I'm assuming the British used it first since it's based off of Greenwich Mean Time. Well, for a good chunk of naval history, the lack of any kind of coordinated central time really didn't make any difference whatsoever for operations in what we might now call different time zones, simply because the speed of travel and the speed of communication was such that coordinating operations across different time zones just wasn't a thing. If you were lucky, you could coordinate something to happen on the same day, but even that was a bit of a stretch, to be perfectly honest. Because yes, you might have dispatched, I don't know, let's say you're the French, and you dispatch your fleet because you're running on Paris time, and you say, okay, well, at 1:45 p.m. on Sunday the 27th, you are going to attack the British colonies in the West Indies in the Caribbean, and at the same time, we are going to launch an invasion of Belgium, because that seems to be what European land powers do. Now, yes, in theory, this sounds like a fantastic plan, but there is absolutely no way for you to guarantee that your fleet is going to be there at that time, let alone on that day, maybe not even on that week, depending on how the weather goes. And yes, you could make allowances and say, okay, well, at such and such a time, if it would normally take us 3 weeks to sail there, okay, we'll give you 6 weeks to sail there, and then we'll launch our attack then and try and coordinate. But the thing is, even that, if there's a really bad storm, might not be long enough. And if the sailing times are more usual, you're going to be showing up and hanging around off this British colony and be like, I wonder why there could be a massive French fleet hovering in the vicinity of some rather precious colonies. So this kind of level of coordination just kind of doesn't happen because everyone realizes it's pointless. And so you end up with circumstances, certainly both at the beginning and the end of wars, and to be honest, even up to World War I, with some areas being a bit out of communication, where ships will show up and be like, hey guys, we're attacking you. And they're like, what do you mean you're attacking us? I'm not aware that there is any war going on. Like, oh, no, yeah, we've been at war for like 3 weeks. Like, oh, really? Okay, well, that's a bit of an unwelcome surprise. We're not ready for you, but I guess we're fighting now. And then, of course, the flip side at the other end of the war is over, the peace treaty is signed, no one's actually told the people across the ocean where the fighting's happening, and you get entire battles being fought after the peace has officially been declared, like USS Constitution's final engagements, the Battle of New Orleans, all that, after, technically speaking, Britain and the US aren't at war. So coordinating things across multiple time zones only really becomes an issue when, one, you're actually capable of doing so, which at the very minimum means telegraph networks, which means the very late stages of the 19th century. And secondly, you have some form of reliable transport going on that will actually let you get forces to where you need to be, i.e. steamships. So again, last probably third or so of the 19th century. And almost as soon as the issue actually started to arise because of the aforementioned factors, there was the International Meridian Conference in 1884, and while there was some discussion, the French really wanted everyone to use the Paris Meridian. Everyone very quickly came around to the idea of, yeah, we're using the Greenwich Meridian and therefore GMT, which everyone was quite happy calling GMT, except the French, who described it as Paris time minus like 9 minutes and something. In part because, hey, at that point, GMT and coordinated time and time zones was mostly set as a useful thing for helping with longitude problems of navigation and shipping. And hey, the British had the majority of the world shipping at that point. And if it wasn't a British ship, it probably sailed to and from ports controlled by Britain. So coordinating with the time zone set layout that the biggest maritime power on the planet was using made a lot of sense, especially because, all of the charts and everything were pretty much all Admiralty charts, and they were all based around the Greenwich Meridian as well. So it was the easiest and smoothest thing to just go, okay, yeah, we're just adopting the Greenwich Meridian, and therefore we're also adopting Greenwich Mean Time, and therefore all the time zones based on that. Unless, of course, as they say, you is French, because, yeah, the French actually, just before World War One, tried again to change things up a bit, but were basically told, no, we've all coordinated on GMT, stop being silly. And not entirely because of France, but largely because of France, is why we now have UTC, or Universal Time Coordinated, which basically means GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. It's just that some people, especially France, don't want to call it Greenwich Mean Time because that means acknowledging that Greenwich is the meridian and not Paris. So, yeah, GMT and UTC, or in military terms, Zulu time, they're all interchangeable. Will Sanders asks, how much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck is the chief bosun's mate of HMS Woodchuck? So, what would HMS Woodchuck be in 1840, 1870, 1900, and 1930? Well, my logic here is that there is no such thing as a woodchuck in the UK. So what is the equivalent of a woodchuck in the UK? Well, it's got to be a small, powerfully burrowing animal that, digs up things it probably shouldn't. At which point in the UK, you're basically left with, at least if you're looking at the general build of a woodchuck, at the very smaller end, a mole, or at the slightly larger end, a badger. So I decided to go with the badger. Now, that would therefore mean, was there an HMS Badger? Yes, there have been several HMS Badgers. So at that point, we can actually just take the historic HMS Badgers and map them to your time periods, and then maybe extrapolate where necessary. So in 1840, well, in 1840, there is an HMS Badger around, and she's a 10-gun brig sloop, although she's very much at the end of her service life, not being used on the front lines at that point because she was launched only 3 years after the Battle of Trafalgar. By 1870, the next HMS Badger has actually already been launched and then scrapped, which was a small gunboat. But 2 years later would see the introduction of the next HMS Badger, which was an iron gunboat. So that would be roughly speaking, the 1871. And then in 1911, which is a little bit far from 1900, but close enough to make even odds, because the iron gunboat HMS Badger is actually still around in 1900. But in 1911, you get the torpedo boat destroyer HMS Badger, which you can see here, being launched. And I think, given that trend of being small, essentially in the age of sail terms, unrated ships and then destroyers, I think if we were to go forward to 1930, given that this Badger, the one you can see on here, was sold in 1921, then HMS Badger would either be potentially a B-class destroyer, but since they didn't actually name a B-class destroyer HMS Badger when they had the opportunity to, then I would say the other alternative would be that HMS Badger would be a sloop, going back to being the 1808 brig sloop, and therefore an anti-submarine vessel, potentially for use in World War II. Andrew Kirshenman asks, in hindsight, looking at the action they were involved in, was there any benefit to building the Iowas instead of more South Dakotas, or getting the Alaskas out sooner? I think you kind of have to split this into two sections. There's the post-World War II utility, where absolutely there is benefit to the Iowas, because they are so much larger than the South Dakotas. They're not cramped in the way that the South Dakotas were, and they're far more powerful and far better protected than the Alaskas ever were going to be. And between that protection, power, and space, it means that they are adaptable multiple times. So obviously you get the reactivation for Korea, reactivation for Vietnam, the reactivation in the 80s, and at that point their speed and size really, really comes into play, because, to be perfectly honest, I can't see even the relatively minimal Harpoon, Tomahawk, and CIWS adaptations, plus all the modern radar suites, really fitting on a South Dakota without major changes. And of course, even on an Iowa, that meant losing some of the 5-inch 38s and redesigning the aft superstructure. And obviously, when the US Navy did its own analysis, they found that, in the immediate post-war environment, running the Alaskas cost almost as much as running the Iowas, both in manpower and money, and fundamentally gave you a smaller and weaker vessel. Now, in terms of World War II itself, I think it's a difficult one because, of course, the Iowas never got involved in a major surface gun action, which is, of course, the raison d'etre of all battleships. They did get involved in some surface gun actions, but not the big anti-capital ship ones. Although, to be fair, it wasn't for lack of trying. So I suppose you could argue that if you substituted the Iowas for another 4 South Dakotas or for 4 Alaskas, theoretically then you could have had a reasonably similar job done by those ships instead. But I think there's 2 big caveats you probably need to flag up. Firstly is that the Iowas, by their existence in terms of their speed, protection and firepower, gave the US battle line a confidence to do certain things that perhaps they would have been less confident to do had they only had battleships that couldn't quite keep up with the carriers, or escorts that could keep up with the carriers but couldn't necessarily go straight up toe-to-toe with Japanese fast capital ships. And of course, there's the fact that some of the points where the Iowas could have been engaged in a surface combat and weren't were down to sheer luck of the dice. So, if you have circumstances changed to a point where you don't have the Iowas, obviously the dice have rolled slightly differently. And then at that point, who's to say that some of those other dice rolls don't go slightly differently? And with the best will in the world, while I like the Alaskas, if you had 2 or 3 Alaskas sitting at the San Bernardino Strait when Centerforce comes piling through, I'm not necessarily thinking that's going to end well. And while I personally wouldn't make the argument, I think maybe someone else could make at least a tenuous argument that the South Dakotas and the Iowas could in some ways be seen as similar to the Revenge class and the Queen Elizabeth class in World War I, albeit with the build order swapped around, in that, in theory, the Revenge class maybe was the more efficient in terms of, build time, build speed, and build cost battle line unit for the conflict, but not the better long-term choice. I can see someone making that argument with a certain degree of justification. I personally wouldn't, but there you go. Rob Smith asks, the World War II county-class cruisers always appear to have too much freeboard, even after their wartime modifications. So, using up some of this excess freeboard to further increase their utility, what would you do? Increase armour, increase power plant, increase anti-aircraft guns, more radar, etc., or what? Well, there are a couple of options, I think. Forgive the slightly crude nature of this, slapped together in Ultimate Allied Dreadnoughts, which isn't the best for replicating the county class, but here's 2 ideas of mine. So this is one idea. So this uses triple turrets, and this is, I think, perhaps a little bit more close to possible because, of course, they have just adopted triple turrets in the Nelsons at the time. So this is a subtle variation on the Nelson class. Now, in theory, that B turret should actually be swiveled around to face forward, but I couldn't get the sort of locking points to work properly. So assume B turret is actually pointing forward. So you've got 2 at-grade turrets and then a super firing turret. And then, as you can see, we've got 4 twin 4-inch down either side. So this is an all-forward layout. Then we've got our quad torpedo tubes, and we've got what should be a quad pom-pom either side of the bridge and a quad pom-pom on a little pedestal aft. And then the stern is clear because then I'm using an American-style stern-mounted aircraft handling facilities in this design. Again, the quad 2-inch comes out looking like a quad POFAS, but there's not a lot I can do about that. And then you've got the other option, which is a bit more ambitious, and this uses quad 8-inch up front. So we're bringing forward the adoption of the quadruple turret, and this will be a really major departure for the Royal Navy because, of course, they don't have any quad turrets in play at this point. But as you can see here, we have our 8 guns up front. We have 3 twin 4-inch down either side. We have 1 little twin 4-inch aft. So we're still getting 8 guns per side in terms of anti-aircraft firepower. We've got our quad launcher, which for some reason I advanced it by a year and it looks like a Japanese launcher, but whatever. We've still got our quad pom-poms either side of the bridge. We've got another one just above the aft 4-inch, and where there's just a barbette with a searchlight on it after the funnel, that is meant to represent an amidships aircraft handling facility. And with all of these, I would bring in a 4.5-inch continuous belt as well. So assume that the hull is sitting a little bit lower in the water because we've taken it down a deck, or maybe had a rising forecastle or something like that. Paul Frederick asks, beginning with the first steam-engined ships, how do they carry or produce enough fresh water to feed the boilers and crew? When were condensers first used, and when did they get into desalinization? So you've essentially got 3 stages. In the very earliest ships to use steam power, the steam engine is either, at least in terms of warships, the steam engine is either very much an auxiliary, or you're talking about harbour vessels. And in either case, you're therefore not going to be using the steam engine for that long or that far away from land. And so you can just use a certain amount of boiler feed water that is aboard the ship, perhaps with some supplements from seawater. Now, you do have a thing called a jet condenser, which is invented before the first major warships have steam engines installed on them. And as steam engines become used more and more in ships, the jet condenser is a big part of that. And yeah, at that point, you are just feeding seawater into the boilers. Now, you might think that's going to end up with a lot of limescale buildup and so forth. Yes, absolutely it would. So part of it was that the pressure that the early steam engines are working at is relatively low. The temperature within the jet condenser is also relatively low. And so you could avoid the worst of limescale buildup. But even then, there was a system in place whereby once the density of the water, because obviously as you keep recondensing it, it gets more and more briny and concentrated. Once the density of the water got up to a certain point and limescale buildup became more of a potential risk, then the water would be partially blown off into the sea, and you'd take in fresh water, i.e. fresh seawater, which would have a lower salinity than the brine you've just gotten rid of, mix it with a little bit of existing fresh boiler feed water, and the process would continue. Again, the fact that steam engines are being used more as auxiliary rather than as a primary propulsion source also mitigates against things. But as the pressure and temperature within steam boilers increases, and also obviously the amount of time you're using the steam engine increases, the increasing salinity of the water and therefore the risk of limescale buildup very quickly becomes exponentially more of a problem. And at that point in the late 1870s, early 1880s, you get the introduction of the surface condenser, which allows you to condense the water in your boilers without having to bring it directly into contact with seawater, so you can maintain fresh boiler water. Obviously, you would top that up with fresh water from boiler feed tanks, but also around about this time in the early 1880s, you start to see desalinization plants being somewhat widespread aboard shipping, which of course then allows you to both produce water for the crew and also produce additional fresh water to feed into your boiler systems. So before the late 1870s, it's a case of this is how much water we have on board, much as it always had been. Just make sure you stop regularly. But that, apart from anything else, is also a big limiter on how much you can use your boilers and therefore your steam engine. But once you get past the late 1870s and the early 1880s, then you have surface condensers and desalinization plants, which essentially put you into the box that you more commonly would experience in obviously the latter part of the 19th century and then into the 20th century of we have boiler feed water, we can create more boiler feed water, and we can control any buildup of particulates and so forth in that water fairly easily. And that brings us to an end for this week's Dry Dock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.